He ordered the plainest woman they could find. What showed up at the station changed everything he thought he knew about beauty, strength, and what a man actually deserves. If you've ever been so afraid of being hurt again that you built walls instead of bridges, this story is for you. Stay until the end, because what happens between Silas Boone and the woman he never wanted will surprise you. Drop a like and comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The letter had taken Silas Boone 3 weeks to write. Not because he struggled with words, he'd always been adequate enough with a pen, but because what he was trying to say felt ridiculous every time he put it down on paper. A grown man, 36 years old, owner of 240 acres of decent Kansas land, writing to a matrimonial agency in St. Louis to ask for a wife. That alone was embarrassing enough. But what made it worse, what made him stare at the ceiling of his cabin night after night before finally committing the words to ink, was the specific nature of his request. "I am not looking for beauty," he had written. "I want a woman who is plain, ordinary in appearance, someone whose face will not turn heads at a social gathering. I have my reasons, and I will not be apologizing for them. What I require is a woman who is capable, hardworking, and loyal. Someone who understands that a frontier ranch is not a place for vanity or romantic notions. I offer a clean home, fair treatment, and a man who keeps his word. I ask only that the agency send me a woman who has had to rely on something other than her looks to get by in this world." He had signed it, sealed it, and ridden 6 miles to Garfield in the early October frost to post it before he could change his mind. That had been 4 months ago. Now it was the 14th of February, 1878, a date that Silas found grimly funny in a way he didn't share with anyone. And he was standing on the platform of the Garfield train station with his hat in his hands and a knot in his stomach that hadn't loosened since breakfast. The wind off the plains was the kind that found every gap in a man's coat. It came from the northwest, carrying the smell of distant snow, and it made the wooden platform creak and the posted announcements flutter against their nails. Around Silas, a handful of other Garfield residents milled about. Herb Dawson from the feed store, who nodded once and looked away. The Mercer widow, who pretended not to watch him. And 2 young ranch hands from the Colton spread who hadn't learned yet that staring at a man's private business was considered impolite. Silas put his hat back on and looked at the track. He had told nobody about the letter. Not his neighbor Dale Hutchins, who would have laughed. Not the Reverend Tully, who would have turned it into a sermon about loneliness and providence. Not the woman at the post office, Mrs. Greer, who knew everything about everyone in a 50-mile radius and could not be trusted with a secret smaller than a mountain. He had kept it to himself, the way he kept most things, folded up tight and stored somewhere people couldn't get to it. The agency's response had come 6 weeks after his letter. A Miss Evelyn Hart, 30 years of age, currently residing in Cincinnati, Ohio, widowed, no children, experienced in domestic management, animal husbandry, and the practical demands of agricultural life, the letter had said. Miss Hart is a capable and serious-minded woman who has expressed a desire for frontier life and understands the challenges therein. She is, as you requested, a woman of ordinary appearance. That last line had given Silas something like relief. He didn't want to feel that way about it. He knew, in the reasonable part of his mind, that it was an ugly thing. To select a wife like you were selecting a workhorse, emphasizing the qualities that made her less likely to attract trouble. But the reasonable part of his mind had been a poor authority since Margaret Hale had smiled at him across a church social 11 years ago and proceeded, over the course of 2 years, to dismantle every careful thing he had built about himself. Margaret had been beautiful, not just pretty. Beautiful, in the kind of way that made men stupid and forgetful. And Silas had been no different. He had courted her for 8 months, proposed in the spring, and spent the following summer planning a life that he had been, he realized now, building entirely inside his own head. Because while he was planning, Margaret had been quietly corresponding with a man named Charles Aldridge, who had come into a significant inheritance and offered her something Silas could not. A house in Kansas City, a life without mud on her boots, and a future that did not require her to wake before dawn to check on the livestock. She had told Silas on a Sunday afternoon, standing in the doorway of his cabin, looking at the floor rather than his face. He hadn't shouted, hadn't begged. He'd stood there and nodded, and after she left, he had walked out to the far pasture and sat down in the grass for a long time, not doing anything in particular. He didn't think about Margaret much anymore. That was the truth of it. He'd thought about her so constantly in the first 2 years that eventually he'd worn the feeling down to something dull and manageable. What remained wasn't grief so much as a kind of structural wariness, a habit of watching for the places where things could go wrong. The train whistle cut through the cold air from somewhere south, and Silas straightened up. Around him, the small crowd on the platform shifted and gathered toward the tracks. He stayed where he was, slightly apart from the others, and watched the black engine emerge from the gray afternoon like something from a dream, slow at first, then overwhelming, filling the station with noise and steam and the shriek of brakes biting iron. The passenger car doors opened. People came down the steps. A family with too much luggage, a traveling merchant with a sample case, two cowboys who looked like they'd been riding for a week without sleeping. Silas watched each one, his jaw tight, and told himself that whatever she looked like, he was going to be civil. Whatever the agency sent him, he was going to keep his word. He'd written in that letter that he kept his word, and that was the one part he was certain was true. Then she stepped off the train. Silas saw her and his stomach dropped somewhere around his boot heels. She was not plain. That was the first thing, and it hit him like a board to the side of the head. She was not ordinary. She was not the unremarkable, work-worn woman he had carefully requested, the one who would make him feel safe in his own home. The woman stepping down from the train car was, he struggled for the word, and the word that came was striking. Not the soft prettiness of a parlor painting, but something sharper and more real. Dark hair pinned back with a severity that was clearly deliberate, several strands escaping anyway. A strong-boned face, good cheekbones, direct eyes that were some color between green and gray that he couldn't quite determine from 20 feet away. She was dressed sensibly, practically. A dark wool traveling dress, heavy boots, a coat that had seen real use, but none of it hid the fact that the agency had sent him exactly the opposite of what he'd asked for. She stood on the platform and looked around with a calm, assessing expression, as though she was taking inventory of the place. Not nervous, not uncertain, just looking, taking stock. Silas was aware, with a sick feeling, that two of the men on the platform had noticed her. He saw Herb Dawson's posture change. He saw one of the Colton Ranch hands nudge the other. He put his hat back in his hands and walked toward her. "Miss Hart?" His voice came out steadier than he felt. She turned. Those gray-green eyes found him without hesitation, like she'd already figured out which man on the platform was likely to be hers. "Mr. Boone," she said. Not a question. "That's right." He stopped a few feet away. He didn't know what else to say. He was looking at her and doing arithmetic in his head, calculating the distance between what he'd asked for and what was standing in front of him. And the numbers weren't adding up to anything comfortable. "You look like you expected someone else," she said. The directness of it startled him. He stopped. Started again. "I had certain expectations, yes. Based on what the agency told you. Based on what the agency told me." A small pause. She studied him without any apparent self-consciousness, which he found both admirable and unsettling. "And I'm not what you expected." "No," he said, because lying seemed pointless. "You're not." Something moved across her face. Not quite a reaction, more like the shadow of one, gone before he could read it properly. "I can explain that," she said, "or we can collect my trunk first. I'd prefer to have that conversation somewhere that isn't a train platform with 4 people watching us." Silas glanced sideways. She was right about the 4 people. He had the uncomfortable sense that she'd counted them without even turning her head. "Trunk's this way," he said. The ride back to the ranch took an hour and 40 minutes in the wagon, across flat land that in February showed nothing but dead grass and pale sky in every direction. Silas drove. Evelyn Hart sat beside him with her hands in her lap and her trunk secured in the wagon bed, and for the first 20 minutes, neither of them said a thing. He was angry, and he knew the anger was unreasonable, and knowing it was unreasonable did not make it any smaller. He'd made a specific request. He'd gone to the trouble of explaining himself, which did not come naturally to him, and the agency had apparently decided his request wasn't worth honoring. And this was the thought that was starting to work its way in around the edges of the anger. They'd honored it in a way he hadn't anticipated. "You want to know what I told them?" Evelyn said, as though she'd been following his thoughts. "I imagine you'll tell me regardless." She didn't take offense at that. I told them I was playing, she said matter-of-factly. That's what I always say. It keeps the letters from men who are looking for a decoration. Silas looked at her sideways. The afternoon light was flat and gray, not flattering to anyone, and even in it she was... He stopped that thought. That's not plain, he said. I know what I look like, Mr. Boone. Her tone was not defensive. It was the tone of someone stating a fact they'd long since gotten tired of discussing. I'm also aware that most men who see me for the first time assume I'm good for exactly two things: standing in a room looking presentable and not much else. I've spent the better part of 10 years correcting that assumption. Telling the agency I was playing was a practical decision. It filters out the men I don't want. Silas sat with that for a moment. And what kind of men don't you want? The kind who look at a woman's face and think they've understood everything about her. The wagon wheels found a rut and lurched. Silas straightened the horses automatically. I could send you back, he said. It came out harsher than he intended. You could, she agreed. That's your right. You'd go without argument? I'd go without argument, she said. I don't want to be anywhere I'm not wanted, but I'd like you to know something before you decide. Go ahead. I read what you wrote in your letter. The agency shares the correspondence, both sides, so the woman can make an informed decision. She looked at him directly. You said you wanted someone who'd had to rely on something other than her looks to get by. I have. Every day of my life, I've had to work twice as hard as anyone expected of me, because the first thing people see when they look at me is what I look like, and they stop thinking after that. I know cattle. I know land. I know how to survive a hard winter and set a broken fence post and keep accounts and make decisions that hold up under pressure. I have done all of those things. She paused. The face is incidental. It's not something I chose, and it's not something that defines what I'm capable of. Silas stared at the road ahead. The horse's breath made small clouds in the cold. You're asking me not to hold it against you, he said finally. I'm asking you to do what you claimed you wanted to do, she said. Judge me by something that actually matters. He didn't answer that. He couldn't right then find the right words. And Silas was, by nature, a man who preferred not to speak until he had the right words available. So he drove, and the flat Kansas land spread out around them, and Evelyn Hart sat beside him with a patience that he found, despite himself, oddly settling. What? The ranch did not present itself well in February. Silas knew this. He knew every shortcoming of the place the way you know the flaws in something you built yourself. The cabin that needed recaulking along the north wall, the barn door that hung crooked on its hinges, the fence line along the east pasture that was 3 posts short of where it was supposed to end. In summer, when the grass came in and the cottonwoods along the creek were green, the place had a kind of rough dignity. In February, it looked like what it was, a working ranch in the middle of nowhere that a single man had been holding together through stubbornness and not much else. He watched Evelyn take it in as the wagon came over the low rise and the property came into view. She didn't say anything. She looked, that careful, systematic look he was starting to recognize as characteristic, and he couldn't tell what she was thinking. It's not much, he said, and then was irritated at himself for saying it. He didn't need to apologize for his property. It's workable, she said. That's a generous assessment. I'm not being generous. I'm being accurate. She pointed toward the south pasture, where 4 of his cattle stood close together near the fence. Those animals are underweight for February. You're going to have feed problems before spring. He looked at the cattle. She was right, and he knew she was right, which he had been quietly worrying about for 3 weeks. I'm aware. Do you have enough hay stored? I have what I have. That's not an answer. He looked at her. She held his gaze with no apology for asking. Probably not, he said after a moment. She nodded as though this confirmed something she'd already calculated. We'll need to deal with that. We. The word sat strangely in the cold air. He hadn't been a we in 11 years, and the sound of it in reference to his own property felt like putting on someone else's coat. He pulled the wagon up in front of the cabin and climbed down, then reached back to help her. She was already climbing down on her own side before he got there. He watched her land neatly in the mud. She'd hiked her skirt up an inch to do it, practical as anything, and immediately look at the cabin wall. North side needs caulking, she said. I know. You can see daylight through it from outside. In this wind, that's significant heat loss. I said I know. He heard the edge in his voice and couldn't quite blunt it. Evelyn looked at him, and her expression wasn't hurt or cautious. It was appraising, the same way she'd been appraising everything else. You're still angry that I'm not what you ordered, she said. I'm not. He stopped, breathed. I'm adjusting. That's fair, she said, which was not the response he'd been braced for. He'd been braced for argument, or wounded feelings, or the particular feminine silence that meant a storm was coming. What he got instead was a woman who seemed to genuinely find his answer reasonable. So am I, she added. You're not exactly what I expected either. What did you expect? She tilted her head slightly, looking at him with those gray-green eyes. Someone older, she said, with worse teeth. The sound that came out of him, he wasn't sure if it was a laugh or not. It was the kind of sound he hadn't made in a while, whatever it was. My teeth are fine, he said. I know. There was the ghost of something on her mouth, not quite a smile but pointed in that direction. I noticed. She picked up her travel bag, refused, with a small gesture, when he reached for it, and walked toward the cabin door. He stood for a moment by the wagon, watching her, and had the unmistakable feeling that something had already shifted, not in a comfortable direction, not in a direction he'd planned for, but shifted, the way the ground shifts just before a season changes, when you can feel it but can't yet see it. He unhooked the horses and led them to the barn, and tried not to think too hard about the woman standing in his kitchen, already looking at every corner of the place with eyes that didn't miss anything. The cabin had 2 rooms. This had not seemed like a problem when Silas lived in it alone. Now, standing in the main room while Evelyn unpacked a portion of her trunk by the light of the oil lamp, it felt considerably smaller than its actual dimensions. He had put clean sheets on the bed in the back room. He would sleep on the cot in the main room, which he'd been using as a cot for odd-hour naps anyway, and which was uncomfortable enough that he doubted he'd sleep much. You don't have to do that, Evelyn said when he mentioned the sleeping arrangement. She was organizing her things with quiet efficiency, a habit he was already beginning to notice. She touched each item once and placed it where it would stay, without rearranging. I'm aware. I'm not delicate, Mr. Boone. I didn't say you were. The offer is kind. I'm accepting it because it's practical, not because I need protecting. She said this without looking up from what she was doing. I want us to understand each other clearly on that point from the beginning. Silas sat down in the chair by the stove. He was a man who did not discuss things much, who had largely run his life on the principle that if you did your work and minded your own business, things tended to sort themselves out. This woman had said more direct things to him in 2 hours than most people said to him in a month. You always talk this much? He asked. She did look up at that, and there was definite amusement in it. When there are things that need to be said, yes. A pause. You always avoid talking this much? Generally? We'll figure it out. She went back to her unpacking. He watched the fire through the grate of the stove and listened to the wind pick up outside, and thought about the cattle in the south pasture, and the hay supply, and the cabin wall that needed caulking, and the woman sitting 12 feet away who had noticed all of those things in the first 20 minutes and said so without any preamble. After a while, she said, Have you eaten? Not since this morning. Do you have food? There's salt pork, some dried beans, cornmeal. She was quiet for a moment. He heard her move to the kitchen area, heard the familiar sounds of someone who knew their way around a cook stove. He thought about telling her she didn't need to, that she'd just arrived, that he could manage his own supper. He didn't say any of it, because the truth was he was tired and he hadn't eaten, and the idea of someone else handling it was more welcome than he wanted to admit. The meal she produced from what he had, salt pork with the beans, cornbread, and a kind of competent miracle with the dried apples from his shelf, was better than anything he'd made for himself in months. He ate without speaking. She ate across the table from him with the same practical attention she gave to everything else. The agency said you were a widow, he said, partway through the meal. She looked up. Yes. How long? 3 years. A pause. His name was Thomas Hart. He died of fever. It was quick, at least. I'm sorry. Thank you. She said it like she meant it, without any of the performance he associated with grief being discussed. He was a good man, a farmer, patient. She looked at her plate for a moment. Not the hardest worker I ever met, but decent to the core, and that matters more than people say it does. Silas had not expected the honesty of that, the way she acknowledged love and limitation in the same breath without contradiction. He thought of Margaret and quickly stopped. "What made you decide on Kansas?" he asked. "Ohio was finished for me," she said simply. "My family is gone. Thomas is gone. I wanted land that still had room in it. I wanted to start something that was mine." She looked up. "Or ours, depending on how this goes." He nodded at that. There didn't seem to be more to say. After supper, she washed the dishes and he dried them. An arrangement that happened without either of them suggesting it, so naturally that he didn't notice it until they were halfway through. When he did notice it, standing beside her at the basin with a dish towel in his hands, he had the strange feeling of someone who has been sleepwalking and suddenly realizes it. He put the last dish away, said goodnight, went and lay down on the cot in the main room and stared at the ceiling while the wind worked at the cabin and the stove ticked and the night settled in around the ranch. He didn't sleep for a long time. He lay there and thought about what she'd said. Judge me by something that actually matters. The problem, and he was only beginning to understand this and didn't like it, was that he had been so focused on protecting himself from one kind of mistake that he hadn't considered the possibility of making a different one entirely. Morning on the ranch came at 5:15, whether you wanted it to or not. Silas rose in the dark and built the fire back up and put coffee on, moving through the familiar motions with the particular blank efficiency of a man who has done the same things in the same order for years. He had his coat and hat on and was heading for the barn when he noticed, with a start that he would not have admitted to anyone, that Evelyn was already in the barn. He could see the lamp burning through the gap under the barn door. He pushed it open. She was checking on his cow, a large brown roan named, insofar as she was named, which was a loose arrangement Silas had with his livestock, Bessie. She had a hand on the animal's neck and was looking at the cow's eyes, and she didn't look up when he came in. "She's off," she said. "Eyes look dull. She eat last night?" Silas felt a prick of defensiveness. "She ate." "How much?" He thought about it. Less than usual, he had to admit. "She's been a little slow this past week. Any chance she's pregnant?" "She shouldn't be." He paused. "But possibly." Evelyn stepped back from the cow and looked at him steadily. She was wearing her heavy coat and a wool hat pulled down over her ears, a strand of dark hair poking out on one side. She looked like she'd been awake as long as he had. "We should watch her," she said. "I know that. I'm not saying you don't know it." No heat in the words, just clarity. "I'm saying I'll help watch her. 2 pairs of eyes are better than 1. He looked at her across the dim, warm interior of the barn, with the animals breathing around them and the lamp throwing soft shadows, and tried to locate the source of the irritation that kept rising in him whenever she said something practical and correct. He found it eventually, standing there with his coffee cooling in his hand. It wasn't that she was wrong. It was that she was right, and being right so consistently, so quickly made him feel like a man who had been managing poorly and not known it, which was an uncomfortable feeling when you'd been surviving alone and calling it competence. "I start on the fence line at first light," he said. "East pasture. 3 posts need resetting. I can help with that after I look at the supply situation." "The supply situation is fine." She looked at him with the tolerant patience of someone deciding not to argue. "The hay situation," she said carefully, "is something we should look at today." He wanted to tell her she'd been here 12 hours, and maybe she could wait before auditing his entire operation. He wanted to say something about how he'd been keeping this ranch running for 7 years without anybody's assessment. He wanted, and this was the part he didn't examine too closely, to find some legitimate flaw in her that would make her easier to dismiss. Instead, he said, "After the fence posts." She nodded. "After the fence posts." By the end of the first week, Silas had a problem that had nothing to do with fence posts or hay supplies, or the ambiguous health of his possibly pregnant cow. The problem was that Evelyn Hart was good at this. Not decent, not adequate. Good. The kind of good that made you stop and look twice, that made you realize you'd been compensating for years without knowing there was something to compensate for. She reorganized the storage shed on the second day, and what she reorganized it into made such obvious sense that he stood in the doorway for a moment, feeling vaguely embarrassed that he hadn't thought of it. Everything accessible by frequency of use. Feed positioned to allow rotation without moving other things. Tools hung at heights that were actually practical for regular use rather than aesthetics. On the third day, she made 2 observations about the livestock management that he implemented without fully intending to, and both of them immediately reduced the amount of time he spent on the morning rounds. On the 4th day, she found a leak in the root cellar that he had been living with for 2 winters, thinking it was minor, and showed him with 3 simple words why it wasn't. Your stores rot. He went and looked and found she was right. Half a winter's worth of root vegetables had been slowly spoiling on the low side of the cellar, and he'd been pulling from the high side and not noticing. By Friday, he had stopped saying, I know every time she pointed something out, because he was running low on things he knew that she didn't already seem to have figured out. He was splitting wood at the end of that first week when Dale Hutchins rode up the lane, apparently in the area on some errand and never one to pass a neighbor's place without stopping. Hutchins was a broad, sunburned man of 50 who had been ranching in this county since before Silas arrived and operated on the understanding that his experience entitled him to opinions on everything around him. Heard you got a mail order wife, he said, in the tone of a man who considers this an amusing curiosity. Word travels fast, Silas said, and kept splitting. Garfield's a small place. Hutchins looked toward the cabin. She settling in? She's working. Something shifted in Hutchins' expression. Silas had lived next to the man long enough to read it, the mild surprise of someone who expected a different kind of answer. Working at what? Ask her yourself if you want to know. He hadn't meant it as an invitation, but Hutchins took it as one, because Hutchins was the kind of man who could find an invitation in a fence post. He climbed down from his horse and ambled toward the barn, where Evelyn had been that morning dealing with the feed situation and had apparently not yet stopped dealing with it. Silas set down his axe and followed. Hutchins was standing in the barn door when Silas caught up. Inside, Evelyn had the hay figures spread out on a barrel lid, actual numbers she'd scratched down, quantities, estimations, and was explaining something to Silas's oldest hand, a weathered 60-year-old named Pete, who had been hired on for odd seasons and was currently looking at the figures with the expression of a man encountering a genuinely novel experience. So the issue isn't the quantity remaining, she was saying, it's the distribution. If we move a portion of the rear stack to the second stall and adjust the rotation, we stretch the current supply another 2 weeks, which gets us past the worst of the cold snaps if the weather pattern holds. Pete looked at the numbers, then at Evelyn, then back at the numbers. That'd work, he said, in a tone of surprise that he didn't fully conceal. Hutchins cleared his throat. Evelyn looked up. Mrs. Boone? Hutchins said, with the exaggerated courtesy that some men use when they are not sure what to make of something. Miss Hart, she said, without apparent concern for the correction. Or Evelyn is fine. You must be a neighbor. Dale Hutchins, got the spread 3 miles east. He looked at the barrel lid with its scratched numbers, looked at Pete, looked at Evelyn. You managing the feed supply? I'm working through the numbers with Pete, yes. Silas generally handles that. Silas has fence posts to deal with, she said evenly. Division of labor is how you get things done. Hutchins looked past her at Pete, as though Pete might offer some useful context for what he was seeing. Pete offered nothing, occupying himself with the hay figures in a pointed way. Hutchins looked back at Evelyn. You know ranching? He said. The question had an edge of skepticism to it, the kind that wasn't quite challenge but wasn't far off. I know enough, she said. She didn't expand on it, didn't try to prove anything. She just looked at him pleasantly and waited. Hutchins glanced at Silas with an expression that said clearly, Where did you find this one? Silas, to his own mild surprise, did not feel like explaining. She's right about the hay, he said simply. We're going to do what she said. He couldn't have said afterward exactly what moved him to say it. He'd been skeptical of her all week. He was honest with himself, not comfortable with the situation. But what Hutchins had in his face in that moment was the particular dismissiveness of a man who has decided a woman's competence is inherently improbable. And Silas, looking at the numbers on the barrel lid, found that he could not get behind that. Hutchins left 20 minutes later, civil enough, but with the air of a man who had seen something that didn't fit any category he had available. Silas went back to the wood splitting. Pete drifted out of the barn a while later, rolled himself a cigarette, and leaned against the fence. She's something, Pete said. Don't start, Silas said. Not starting anything. Pete smoked for a moment. Just noticing. A pause. The Hay situation she worked out is actually good. Better than what I'd have done. I said don't start. Pete finished his cigarette in silence and went back to work. On Sunday, Silas found her sitting at the table with his account books. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her, looking at the books, and felt the particular complicated sensation of a man who has been invaded in a way he specifically requested. He'd asked for a capable woman. He'd asked for someone who could contribute practically. He was getting exactly what he'd asked for, and the problem, the actual thorny, embarrassing problem, was that it scared him. Not in a way he could put a simple name to, but in the way that anything does when it's better than expected and you've built your whole approach on expecting the worst. I didn't say you could look at those, he said. She looked up. She'd been making notations in the margin in small, precise handwriting. You didn't say I couldn't, she said reasonably. And if we're going to plan the spring planting budget, I need to understand what we're working with. We again. He walked to the table and sat down across from her. Outside, the wind was building from the northwest. Not a storm yet, but the sound that preceded one, a particular hollow note in the cottonwoods. He listened to it for a moment. What are your findings? He said finally, because she was going to tell him regardless, and he might as well engage with it directly. She turned the book toward him and showed him what she'd worked out. A clear-eyed summary of where money was coming in, where it was bleeding out, and 3 specific adjustments that would change the picture meaningfully before the end of the year. He read it. He didn't argue with any of it. You've done this before, he said. I kept accounts for 5 years on Thomas's farm, she said. And before that I worked in my father's dry goods store from age 12. She folded her hands on the table. I know numbers. He sat with that. Outside, the wind found the corner of the cabin and made a sound like breath. I owe you an acknowledgement, he said. The words were difficult and came out stilted, but he got them out. You've pulled your weight this week, more than. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully classify. Thank you, she said. That means something, coming from you. Why from me specifically? A small pause. Because you've been trying to find a reason to send me back since the moment you saw me at that station. She said it without accusation, just observation. And you haven't. He looked at the account book, at the small, precise notation she'd made in the margins. No, he said, I haven't. The wind made another sound outside, and somewhere in the barn one of the horses shifted and stamped, and the lamp between them threw their shadows long against the wall. Silas thought about what he was going to say next for a long time before he said it, because he wanted to get it right. I wrote that letter, he said slowly, because I thought that if I could control what she looked like, what you looked like, I could control what happened, whether things went wrong. He paused. That's a foolish piece of thinking. I'm aware of it. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. When she answered, her voice was level but not cold. I told the agency I was playing because I wanted a man who wouldn't stop at my face, who would keep looking. She looked at him steadily across the table. We both came here protecting ourselves from something. That's not so different. He held her gaze, didn't look away. No, he said. It's not. The lamp flickered briefly in a draft from the north wall, the wall that needed caulking, and settled again. Silas made a note in his mind to deal with that tomorrow. It was getting colder, and it would get colder still before it got better, and the wind that was building tonight had the feel of something that meant business. He pulled the account book back across the table and looked at her notations again. Walk me through the spring budget, he said. And she did. The caulking took most of Monday morning. Silas mixed the compound in the cold, his fingers going stiff and clumsy in the February air, and worked his way along the north wall inch by inch, with the patience that physical work required, and that he was, at least, good at. Evelyn appeared at his elbow around 9 o'clock, with a cup of coffee, and held it out without comment. He took it without comment. She went back inside, and he heard her moving around in the storage area, doing something with the shelving he'd told her last week he was going to get to eventually. He didn't say anything about it. That was the shape of it now after 10 days. This unspoken negotiation where they moved around each other's business with a care that was not quite comfort, but was getting less like friction. She didn't ask permission for things she'd already decided to do. He'd stopped pretending he was going to do them first. It was a practical arrangement, and he told himself that was all it was. Pete noticed, of course. Pete noticed most things, and had the good sense to keep the majority of them to himself. But on Tuesday afternoon, when Evelyn was out with the cattle and Silas was repairing the barn door hinge, Pete leaned on the post beside him and said, "You look less like a man waiting to be ambushed." "I don't know what that means," Silas said. "Sure you do, you." He tightened the bolt and did not respond. Pete, having made his point, went back to mucking out the stalls with the cheerful indifference of a man who has said exactly what he intended to say. The thing was, and Silas turned this over in his mind in the early mornings, when the ranch was quiet and he had time to think without interruption, Evelyn was not what he'd expected in any of the ways that mattered. He'd expected a capable woman and gotten one, which was what he'd asked for, and no surprise there. But he'd expected capability in the quiet, deferential way of someone who knew their place in another person's house. What he hadn't expected was capability with opinions attached. Capability that looked at his operation with fresh eyes and said, plainly and without apology, "This could be better, and here is how." On the Wednesday of the third week, she asked him about the Eastfield. They were eating supper. She cooked most nights, not because he'd asked her to, but because she was faster, and he knew it. And neither of them had discussed it. And she had the quality she always had at supper of seeming to have spent the meal gathering toward something. "The East Field," she said. "What are you planning to do with it this spring?" "Same as every year, alfalfa." She was quiet for a moment, cutting her pork. "Have you thought about rotating to winter wheat?" "Partial rotation, not the whole field." He looked at her. "Alfalfa's what this land produces well. Alfalfa's what you've always planted. That's not the same thing." She set her fork down and looked at him directly. "The soil on the east side. The clay content is higher. Alfalfa needs drainage. Winter wheat does better in heavier soil, and the market for it is stronger this year. I checked the figures at the Garfield dry goods store last week when I went for supplies. The price per bushel margin is—" "You checked the market figures," he said. "I was already in town." "When did you go to town?" "Tuesday, while you were working the fence line." She picked up her fork again. "I took the old mare. I left a note on the table." He had not seen the note. He didn't say that. "You bought supplies." "I did. With my own money, since we haven't discussed a household arrangement yet. Which we should." She said all of this with the brisk matter-of-factness of someone who has organized the conversation in her head beforehand and is moving through it efficiently. "But the wheat question is separate from the money question. I wanted to raise it while I had the numbers in mind." Silas sat back in his chair and looked at her across the small table, and he had the feeling he'd had a few times now, a sensation of trying to keep up with someone who was already 2 steps ahead and not slowing down. He didn't know whether to find it annoying or reassuring. Most days it was both. "Show me the numbers," he said. She got up and retrieved a folded piece of paper from the shelf near the door. She spread it on the table between them. He looked at what she'd done. A comparison, clear-eyed and specific, with the alfalfa yields from his last 3 years laid against projected wheat yields based on the soil type and the current market price. The math was not complicated, but the result was plain enough. "This is if everything goes well," he said, pointing at her wheat projection. "That's the mid-estimate. I put the low estimate here and the high here." She indicated each column. "Even the low estimate is competitive with last year's alfalfa. The mid-estimate is better, and it's better for the soil long-term." He sat with it. He'd been farming alfalfa on that field for 6 years because his predecessor had farmed alfalfa, and because he knew alfalfa, and because changing things required a reason, and he'd never had a reason he could put numbers to. Now he had one. He wasn't sure what to do with the particular feeling of that, of being shown, clearly and without condescension, that he'd been leaving something on the table. "I'll think about it," he said. "That's all I'm asking." She folded the paper and left it on the table between them, within reach. He noticed she did that, left things within reach rather than putting them away, as though she understood that a man who needed time to think also needed the thing available when he was ready to look at it again. He did think about it. By Friday, he told her they'd try the partial rotation. She said, "Good," and nothing more than that. The wheat rotation was the first of several things like it over the following weeks. Small changes, each individually defensible on practical grounds, that together were beginning to add up to something different, a different rhythm to the operation, a different way of thinking through problems. Not in isolation, the way he'd always worked, but in conversation. She would raise something. He would push back. She would hold her position if she had the numbers, or adjust if he had a point she hadn't considered. There was nothing gracious about it. They both had edges, and the edges sometimes caught on each other. But the results held up. Pete told him in March that the ranch felt different. More like somebody steering it, he said, which Silas found mildly offensive and declined to examine too closely. The trouble started, as trouble in small communities often does, not from the land or the weather, but from other people. Garfield was not a large settlement. Maybe 200 residents in town and perhaps another 300 scattered across the surrounding ranches and homesteads, which meant that everyone knew most things about everyone else within a reasonable amount of time, and that new information about a neighbor traveled fast. The mail-order wife situation had been known to most of Garfield almost immediately, in the way that Silas had expected and resigned himself to. What he had not expected was the specific quality of attention that Evelyn attracted once people began to understand what kind of woman she actually was. The first real indication of this came on a Saturday in early March, when Evelyn rode into Garfield with him to pick up supplies and settle the accounts at Dawson's feed store. Herb Dawson was a man who ran his store with a certain confident authority, and who had been selling Silas his supplies for 4 years in the comfortable arrangement of two men who understood a transaction. He greeted Silas from behind the counter with his customary nod, and then looked at Evelyn with the politely surprised expression of a man encountering something he'd heard about but hadn't seen yet. "This would be your wife," Dawson said. "Miss Hart," Silas said, for what was becoming the standard correction. Evelyn extended her hand across the counter, which briefly confused Dawson before he shook it. "Mr. Dawson, I've heard you're the best-stocked feed store in the county." Dawson straightened slightly, pleased. "We do all right. I wanted to ask you about your pricing on the mixed grain." She produced the list she'd made that morning from her coat pocket. "We've been buying it at $3.60 a bushel, which I understand was the standard rate. But I noticed that Whitmore's in Colby is advertising at $3.10, and I was wondering whether there was room for Silas to negotiate a better arrangement, given how long he's been a customer." A silence followed. Dawson looked at the list, looked at Evelyn, looked at Silas, who made no particular expression, looked back at Evelyn. Miss Hart," he said, "the pricing is generally something we work out with the account holder." "I understand," she said pleasantly. "And Silas can certainly speak to it if you'd prefer. I'm just raising the question while we're all here." Dawson's eyes went to Silas again. There was something in them that was looking for confirmation, or perhaps for permission, or perhaps for the assurance that what was happening was unusual, and that Silas found it as unusual as Dawson did. Silas said, "She's got the right of it on Whitmore's price. What can you do?" What Dawson could do was $3.20, after a negotiation that took 7 minutes and that Evelyn conducted with a calm that made Dawson look slightly flustered by comparison. They walked out of the feed store with a better rate on the grain and a somewhat altered relationship with Herb Dawson, who stood in his doorway watching them go with an expression Silas could not categorize with any confidence. On the walk to the dry goods store, Silas said, "You could have let me do that." "You were going to pay $3.60, she said. "I know the rate at Whitmore's." "Did you know it when you came in?" A pause. "I would have gotten around to it." She glanced at him sideways, not quite smiling. $3.60, she said. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite an acknowledgement, and kept walking. The dry goods store was owned by a woman named Clara Voss, a sharp-eyed widow of 55 who had been running the store since her husband died, and who, in Silas's experience, watched people carefully and kept what she observed to herself. She regarded Evelyn with what appeared to be genuine interest from the first moment. "You're the one who reorganized Silas Boone's storage shed," she said, when Evelyn introduced herself. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "That traveled. Pete Greer shops here. He doesn't talk much, but when he does..." Clara looked at Evelyn with an expression of frank appraisal. "He said you calculated the hay rotation and gave yourself an extra 2 weeks of feed." "It wasn't complicated, just needed someone to sit with the numbers. Pete said it was better than what the county extension man suggested last fall." "I don't know what he suggested," Evelyn said. "I just worked with what was there." Clara Voss smiled, which was an expression Silas had seen on the woman's face rarely enough that he noticed it. Come back and have coffee sometime, she said to Evelyn. Not the store kind. My kitchen kind. Evelyn said she would, and meant it, and Silas found himself watching this exchange with the odd feeling of a man watching something take root in unfamiliar soil, something small and possibly significant that he couldn't yet name. Not everyone in Garfield shared Clara Voss's attitude. Silas had known this would be the case, and it was. Roy Mercer was the most direct about it. He caught Silas outside the livery on a Thursday with the forthright rudeness of a man who has decided on his position and sees no reason to soften it. I hear your woman's been giving Dale Hutchins advice on his cattle rotation, Mercer said. Silas, who had not heard this, said, That's so. Dale asked her about something, and she gave him half an hour of what he should be doing different. Mercer's tone was the tone of a man reporting an irregularity. She's a bold one. Dale asks questions, he tends to get answers, Silas said. She's your wife. She's not my wife. Mercer made the kind of pause that meant he found that distinction unimportant. She's your woman. The point is, there are people who find it strange. A woman going around the county with opinions about other men's land management. Silas looked at Roy Mercer, at his certain, settled face, at the way he held his certainty, the way some men held their hats as though it were evidence of something, and said, Dale's cattle better or worse? Mercer blinked. What? Dale's cattle, after her advice. Better or worse? A brief silence. That's not the point. It's exactly the point, Silas said, and got back on his horse. He rode home with a flatness in his chest that he recognized as anger cooling into something harder. He didn't particularly like confrontation. He'd never been a man who enjoyed that kind of standing his ground moment the way some men did, performing it for an audience. He'd just found, in the moment, that the alternative, agreeing with Roy Mercer or staying quiet and allowing Mercer to take the quiet as agreement, was not something he was willing to do. He told Evelyn about it that evening. He wasn't sure why he told her. It wasn't his habit to report things. But he found himself doing it anyway, sitting at the table after supper with the coffee she'd made and giving her the conversation more or less as it had happened. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at her cup. Does it bother you? She asked. What people think. It doesn't matter what it does to me. It matters what it does to you. She looked up at that, and something moved across her face that he couldn't entirely read. A quick, unguarded thing. There and gone. I've had opinions about other people's land management since I was 15 years old, she said. My father's neighbors used to come to him for advice and then be surprised when some of the best ideas were mine. That's not new. A pause. But it's different here. Different how? There I was, the dry goods man's daughter. Here I'm a woman who arrived on a train with an unusual arrangement and too much to say. She turned her cup in her hands. People want to find a category for me. If I'm helping my husband, that's one thing. If I'm helping the neighbors, that's something else. You could stop, he said. Helping the neighbors. She looked at him with an expression that was both amused and slightly offended. I could, she said. Should I? He held her gaze. The lamp between them was burning low, and outside it was fully dark now, and the ranch was quiet with the particular quiet of winter evenings. No, he said. I don't think you should. She was quiet for a moment. Why not? It was a fair question, and he took it seriously. Because they're asking, he said, and because you're right more than you're wrong, and in this county being right about your land matters more than what people think about who's doing the talking. She looked at him for a long time. Not the appraising look, the inventory look, something a little more direct than that. Thank you, Silas, she said. It was the first time she'd used his first name without any kind of self-consciousness, just naturally, the way you use the name of someone who has become real to you. He picked up his coffee cup and drank, and did not say anything else, but the name sat with him in the quiet of the cabin for the rest of the evening. Through March and into April, the ranch continued its transformation in the quiet, incremental way that real change tends to happen. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in the accumulation of small adjustments that each make a small difference and together make a large one. Evelyn made arrangements with 2 neighboring ranches to share the cost of a better bull for the breeding season. Silas had never considered proposing something like it because he had never, before this, thought of ranching as a collaborative project. Each man's operation was his own, and that was the frontier way. But when the proposal came back from the Hutchins spread and the Colton place as a yes, and when the breeding results that spring showed improvement on all three properties, Silas found he was able to set aside his skepticism and just observe the result. "You knew they'd say yes," he said to her when the Hutchins confirmation came. "I thought they would," she said. "Hutchins respects good mathematics. Colton respects whatever Hutchins does." She was pinning her hair back, getting ready to go out to the morning round, speaking matter-of-factly. "I wasn't certain, but you asked anyway. If you don't ask, the answer's always no." She pulled on her coat. "That's something my father told me when I was 10, and I've never found an exception to it." He held the door for her, a habit he'd developed without planning to, around the 4th week, and they walked out into the April morning together, and the grass was coming in green and the cottonwoods along the creek were budding, and the land looked the way it looked in spring, which was the way that reminded you why you'd come here in the first place. Pete was already at the barn. He looked up when they came in and said, in his economical way, "Bessie." They both looked in the roan cow. She'd been watched on and off since February, when Evelyn had first flagged her dull eyes. She had, in fact, turned out to be pregnant, a revelation that had caused Silas a complicated conversation with himself about how that had happened, and was now, 3 weeks before they'd expected her to be, showing signs that the calf was coming. "How far along?" Evelyn asked Pete. "Few hours, maybe. Could be more." Pete looked at the cow's side. "She's not in distress yet." "We'll watch her," Silas said. They took shifts. This too had become a natural arrangement, the way they'd divided the night watches during the 2 bad cold snaps of February and March, each taking a portion without long discussion, each reliable on their portion without the other needing to check. He took the first watch. She came out at midnight, and he went inside and slept 3 hours and came back, and she was where he'd left her, sitting on a hay bale with a lantern, watching Bessie with the patient attention of someone accustomed to waiting. The calf came in the early morning with more difficulty than Silas would have liked, but less than he'd feared, and afterward he sat on the ground with his back against the stall wall, tired in the bone-deep way that comes after a concentrated effort, and Evelyn sat 3 feet away in a similar posture, and they both looked at the calf working its way upright on shaky legs, while Bessie turned her head to look at the thing she'd made. "She's all right," Evelyn said, watching the cow. "She's all right." A quiet stretch between them. Not uncomfortable. The barn held the warmth of the animals and the low light of the lantern, and outside the sky was just beginning to lighten at the edges. "I didn't know you could do that," he said. "What you did with the positioning." She looked at him sideways. "Which part?" "When the calf wasn't turned right. The way you—" He made a gesture, not quite finding the words for the specific quiet competence she'd shown at the crucial moment. The way she'd calmly told him what to do without any of the panic that the situation might have earned. "My father had cattle," she said. "I helped with calving from when I was 11. Mostly, you just need to stay calm and pay attention." She paused. "And have smaller hands than the man next to you sometimes." He looked at her hands. They were not small hands for a woman's, but compared to his, yes. She caught him looking, and something passed between them. Not quite amusement, not quite anything he had a clean word for. "Thank you," he said, "for tonight. That's what I'm here for." He thought about that sentence. That's what I'm here for. And all the ways it could be meant, the flat utilitarian way and the other way, the way that included more. He didn't ask which she meant. He sat on the ground in his barn in the early morning while a new calf found its legs, and he thought that the ranch, right now in this light, looked like something he'd built on purpose. Not something he was simply maintaining. That was new. He was fairly sure he knew who had made it new, and he was not yet ready to look directly at what that meant. But he was aware of it, the way you're aware of a fire in a dark room. Not from looking at it, but from the fact that you can suddenly see everything else. The first warning came on a Tuesday in late November, in the way that weather warnings on the Kansas plains always came, not from any instrument or official declaration, but from the animals. Silas noticed it in the morning. The horses were restless in the barn, shifting and stamping without cause. The cattle had moved from the open pasture toward the fence line closest to the shelter of the low hill on the south end, a thing they did by instinct, by some understanding of atmosphere that preceded any human awareness of what was coming. He stood in the barn door with his coffee and watched the sky, which was the wrong color for late November. Not the iron gray of normal winter cloud cover, but something with a greenish undertone at the horizon, faint enough that you could convince yourself you were imagining it. He was not imagining it. Evelyn came out of the cabin and stood beside him and looked at the same sky, and he watched her read it the same way he was reading it, with the careful attention of someone who has learned that the land will tell you what it intends if you pay close enough attention. "How long do you think?" she said. "Day and a half? Maybe 2 days." He drank his coffee. "Could be faster. That southwest color is moving." She looked at the cattle near the south fence. "We need to get them closer to the barn." "I know. And the hay situation. We added a reserve in October, but if this runs long, I know, Evelyn." She glanced at him sideways at the use of her name, which he'd been doing more naturally these past months, and something in her expression settled. She had, he'd noticed, a particular response to being taken seriously. Not gratitude exactly, but a kind of ease, as though she were setting down something she'd been carrying unnecessarily. "All right," she said, "I'll start on the food stores inside. I'll get Pete and we'll move the herd." They moved through the morning with the particular focused efficiency of people who have been working beside each other long enough to anticipate where the other person is going to be. Pete arrived early. He'd looked at the same sky on his ride over and come already understanding the situation, and the three of them spent the morning hours redistributing livestock, moving the hay reserve to accessible positions, reinforcing the barn door latch that had been stiff since September, and doing the dozen other things that needed doing before a serious storm hit a working ranch. By midday, the wind had picked up from the northwest, and the temperature had dropped 8 degrees. By mid-afternoon, the sky had gone the flat, uniform white that meant snow was close. They were as ready as they were going to be. Pete headed home to his own place before dark. He had his own animals to see to, and Silas didn't argue it. The three of them stood outside the barn for a moment, the wind cutting through every gap in their coats, and Pete said, "She's going to be mean," with the straightforward assessment of a man who has survived many Kansas winters and is still not casual about them. "She's going to be mean," Silas agreed. Pete nodded and got on his horse and rode into the thickening gray afternoon. And then it was just Silas and Evelyn and the ranch, which was the way most evenings were, and which had stopped feeling unusual sometime around May, and which now felt, if he was being honest with himself, like the natural condition of things. The snow started before supper. By the time they ate, it was coming in sideways, and by 8 o'clock the wind was making a sound against the cabin walls that Silas had not heard in 4 years. A low, continuous roar like water over a falls, steady and indifferent and enormous. He went to the door and opened it and felt the cold hit him like a wall. Visibility out toward the barn was maybe 30 feet. Beyond that was nothing but white and dark combined into a confusion that had no landmarks in it. He closed the door and latched it. Evelyn was sitting at the table with her mending, which she'd taken up this fall and which he had come to understand was not a domestic habit, so much as a thing her hands needed when her mind was working. She had the look she got when she was thinking about something adjacent to what she was doing. "The cattle are in the barn," he said. "I know. It's going to be a bad night." She looked up at him. "I know that too." He sat down in the chair by the stove. Outside, the blizzard was finding its voice, the kind of storm that has intention in it, or at least that's how it felt in the small, warm interior of the cabin, with the walls doing their job and the fire burning and the lamp making its little circle of light. The north wall had been properly caulked since February and didn't draft anymore, which was one small satisfaction in an otherwise serious night. They sat for a while. He did the account ledger for November, which was overdue. She mended. The storm made its noise outside, and occasionally something would hit the cabin, a piece of debris or a gust with particular force, and the walls would shudder and settle. At 9:30, he went and checked on the fire in the stove and added a log and thought about Bessie's calf, which was now 9 months old and had been moved inside the barn that morning with the others. "Get some sleep," he told Evelyn. "I'll check the barn at midnight." She looked at him with an expression that was not quite argument, but was adjacent to it. She had the particular look of someone deciding how much to push. "I'll take the 2 o'clock check," she said, which was not what he'd said, but was her version of an agreement. "Fine," he said. She went to bed. He sat up until midnight, listening to the storm, and then put on every layer he owned and went out to check the animals. The barn check took 20 minutes. The animals were unsettled, but accounted for. Bessie's calf had wedged itself between its mother and the far wall of the stall, which was animal intelligence at its most practical. He checked the barn door was holding, checked the roof beams for anything alarming. There was a creak up there he didn't like, but it held, and went back to the cabin and stripped off his outer layers and sat down and thought about the creak for a while before deciding it was manageable. He was asleep in the chair by 1:30. The sound that woke him came at 2:47. He knew the time because he looked at the clock on the shelf in the first second of waking, before he was fully conscious of why he was awake. It was not the storm. He'd been sleeping through the storm just fine. It was a sound from inside the barn, something the storm was not making, and it took him 3 seconds of being fully awake to name it. It was Bessie. Not the normal sound she made, something lower and more sustained, with a repetition to it that he knew from 9 months ago in a cold April morning. The particular distress of an animal in serious difficulty. He was on his feet and moving before he'd finished the thought. He had his coat and boots on, and the barn lantern lit in under 2 minutes, which was as fast as a man could do it in the dark, with cold hands. He unlatched the cabin door, and the blizzard came in at him like it had been waiting, and for a moment the cold was so absolute and the wind so loud that he could not hear anything from the barn at all. He put his head down and moved. The 20 feet between the cabin and the barn door was the longest 20 feet of his night. The wind was coming from the northwest at a force that required him to lean into it at an angle that felt like it should topple him, and the snow was the kind that came horizontally and found every edge of every piece of clothing. He held the lantern low where the flame was slightly more protected and moved. He got the barn door open, which required everything he had against the force of the storm, and got inside and pulled it shut behind him, and stood for a moment just breathing. The barn was cold the way a barn is cold when a blizzard is working on it from every side, but quiet compared to outside, which made Bessie's sounds immediately clear and alarming. He went to her stall in 4 strides. The situation was apparent in the first seconds of looking at it. Bessie's calf, the 9-month-old bull calf, who had been doing well and gaining weight and was by any measure a financial and practical success, had somehow gotten himself into a position that was going to kill him if Silas didn't fix it in the next quarter hour. He'd gone down in the stall and folded wrong, and was now wedged against the stall wall in a way that was cutting off circulation to his back legs. Bessie was circling the stall in the limited space available to her, making the sound he'd heard, her eyes white-rimmed and wild. Silas set down the lantern and got into the stall and assessed. He needed to move the calf, which weighed close to 300 pounds at this point and was not going to cooperate. He needed both hands free, which meant no lantern. And in the dark of the barn in a blizzard, he could not see well enough to do what needed to be done safely. He needed someone to hold the light. He stood in the stall for 2 seconds with the calf's distress sounds, and Bessie's circling and the blizzard roaring outside, and he did the calculation that he already knew the answer to, and then he turned and went back to the barn door. He had not intended to get Evelyn. He had intended, when he woke and went out, to handle whatever the problem was himself, and then come back and tell her in the morning, matter-of-factly, in the way that he handled most things. Alone first, report later. That was his habit, his preference, the way he'd operated for years. But he needed the light held steady, and he needed it held by someone who would not panic. And when he thought about the people available for that job on this ranch on this night, there was only one answer, and it was currently asleep 10 feet from the barn. He went back out into the blizzard. The cabin door opened before he reached it. Evelyn was standing in the doorway, already dressed, coat, boots, hat, her heavy wool scarf, with her own lantern in her hand, lit. She had the look of someone who had been awake. "I heard her," she said. "Calf's down wrong in the stall. I need light." She was already moving past him into the storm. He turned and followed her back across the 20 feet of howling dark. Inside the barn, she assessed the situation in the same way she assessed everything, quickly and without commentary, and without being told anything further, she positioned herself where the lantern light would be most useful. At the corner of the stall, arm extended, the flame cupped in her other hand against the drafts that the storm was finding through the barn walls. The light fell exactly where he needed it. "Tell me when you need it moved," she said. He got down in the stall with the calf and went to work. What followed was not quick, and it was not clean. The calf was frightened and heavy and uncooperative in the way that large, frightened animals are. And Silas was working in a cold stall in the middle of the night with a storm trying to take the barn apart around him. And there were 2 points in the next 40 minutes where he was not certain he was going to be able to do what needed to be done. His hands went from cold to painful to a numb state that was worse than painful because he couldn't fully gauge what they were gripping. His back was going to argue with him for a week about the angle he was holding for the better part of an hour. But the light never moved. Every time he needed it repositioned, he said so, and Evelyn moved it. Every time the draft found the flame and threatened it, he heard her hands shift to protect it. He could not see her face from his position in the stall. He could see her arm and her hands and the lantern, the circle of light they maintained together against the dark and the cold. She did not ask how it was going. She did not make suggestions he hadn't asked for. She simply held the light with a steadiness that he felt more than saw, because the shadows on the stall wall stayed consistent and the flame burned clean, and in the conditions outside the barn that represented a sustained act of will. He got the calf repositioned at 3:42 in the morning. He knew the time because afterward, when the calf struggled to its feet and Bessie stopped circling, he looked at his watch with hands that were shaking with cold and effort and saw the hands at 3:42, and he sat down on the hay in the stall with his back against the wall and stayed there for a moment, just breathing. Evelyn lowered the lantern. He heard her shift, heard the small sounds of someone who has been holding one position too long and is feeling it. He looked over at her. She was leaning against the stall post with the lantern at her side, and she was unwrapping the wool scarf from her hands. Not her face, her hands. She had wound the scarf around both hands at some point to protect them from the cold and the draft, which was why the lantern had stayed so steady. Her fingers, when they emerged from the wool, were the color of old wax. She was flexing them carefully, working the circulation back in with the deliberate focus of someone managing pain without wanting to announce it. "Your hands," he said. "They're all right." "Evelyn, they're all right," she said again more firmly. "The calf?" He looked at the calf, which was on its feet and leaning into its mother. "He'll be sore in the back legs for a day or two, but he's upright." He paused. "He'd have been dead by morning." She nodded, still working her fingers. She had not looked at him directly since coming back into the barn, and he had the sense that she was using the task of her hands to buy herself a moment of not being looked at. He understood the impulse. He was not always comfortable being looked at directly after something had cost him something. "Come inside," he said. "Warm them up." She didn't argue, which told him her hands were worse than she'd said. They crossed back through the storm, shorter than before somehow, maybe because they both knew what they were going back to, or maybe because the storm had eased a fraction in the last hour, or maybe because Silas was walking closer beside her than he had been the first time, in the unconscious way of a man who has stopped keeping distance and not noticed when it happened. Inside the cabin, he built the fire up and put water on and got a basin warm, and she held her hands in it and said nothing, and he sat across the table from her and watched, and also said nothing for a while. Her hands in the warm water went from wax pale to a red that was better to look at, and some of the tension in her face eased as the feeling came back. He'd had hands that cold before. He knew what the coming back felt like, which was not pleasant in the first several minutes. "You should have stayed inside," he said. He said it without heat, because it was not an argument, just something that had to be named. She looked up at him. "You needed the light." "I could have found another way." In a storm like this, in a dark barn, repositioning a 300-pound frightened calf alone. She said it flatly, not as challenge, but as the facts of it. What other way? He didn't have an answer for that, because there wasn't one. That was the truth of it. He'd gone back to the cabin for her because there was no other way, and every part of him that defaulted to doing things alone had known it. "I didn't want you out in that," he said. "I know you didn't." She looked at her hands in the basin. "But Silas, I am not a woman who stays inside while work needs doing." A pause. "I thought you understood that by now." He had understood it. He'd understood it since the first week, when she'd appeared in the barn before him in the early morning. He'd understood it every day since, in every practical demonstration of what she was. The problem. And he was sitting with it now, clearly, in the warm kitchen in the early hours of the morning, with the blizzard outside and her hands in a basin of warm water. was that understanding what a person was and fully accepting what it meant were not always the same thing. He had asked for a plain woman because he thought a plain woman would be safer to be attached to. That had been his logic, and it was the worst logic he'd ever applied to anything because it had missed the point entirely. What made Evelyn Hart impossible to be indifferent to was not her face. He knew that now with the clarity of a man who has been shown the same lesson from enough angles that he can no longer pretend he hasn't learned it. It was the way she held a lantern in a blizzard for nearly an hour, with her hands going numb, and never said a word about it until the work was done. It was the way she'd been in this place, not just on this ranch, but in his life, which was a different thing, a larger thing, for 9 months, and had changed the shape of it so thoroughly that he could not remember the previous shape clearly anymore. He looked at her across the table. She was watching her hands in the water, her expression private, her dark hair loose around her shoulders because she'd come out in a hurry and hadn't pinned it back. The lamp between them was burning the way it always burned at this hour, and the stove was doing what it was made to do, and the storm outside was still making its noise, but the cabin held against it, the way it had held since he'd caulked the north wall in February, which she had told him to do. "Evelyn," he said. She looked up. He'd had something he wanted to say, but when she looked at him directly with those gray-green eyes, the prepared sentence went somewhere he couldn't retrieve it from. He sat for a moment with the silence. "Thank you," he said finally. "I mean it." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he was only beginning to be able to read. Not the inventory look, not the appraising look, but something quieter and less guarded than either. "I know you mean it," she said. He got up and refilled the basin with warmer water and set it back in front of her, and she put her hands in it again, and they sat in the warm kitchen while the blizzard worked outside, and neither of them spoke for a while. What Silas was thinking about, in that silence, was something Evelyn had said to him on the first night, the very first evening, at supper, after she'd cooked a meal from his spare supplies, and they'd sat across from each other like two people who'd been told to figure each other out. She had said, "I only wanted someone willing to respect my mind, strength, and determination." He'd heard the words then. He hadn't understood them yet. Understanding was different from hearing. It came slower and required more evidence, and sometimes required standing in a blizzard at 3 a.m, watching someone hold a lantern so steady they sacrificed the feeling in their own hands. He understood them now. He looked at her hands in the basin. The color was better. She was flexing them carefully, and the pain of returning circulation had mostly passed from her face, replaced by the particular exhausted calm of someone who has been through something and come out the other side of it. "How are they?" he asked. She flexed each finger deliberately, testing. "They'll be sore tomorrow. Nothing permanent." She looked up. "I've been colder." "When?" "Winter of '73, in Ohio. The creek flooded and we lost the footbridge, and I had to wade through water up to my thighs in January to get to my neighbor's place." She paused. She was sick and alone. Someone had to go. He looked at her. "Of course you were the one who went." Something in her expression shifted. The faint beginning of something, not quite a smile. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm not surprised," he said. "That's what it means." She looked at him steadily for a moment, and the almost smile settled into something quieter and more real. She lifted her hands from the basin and wrapped them in the cloth he'd set beside her and held them there. "Go to sleep, Silas," she said gently. "The calf is alive. The barn is standing. We did what needed to be done." He nodded. He stood and turned the lamp down and added the last log to the fire that would hold until morning and moved toward the cot in the main room. At the doorway, he stopped. "Evelyn." "Yes." He stood there with his hand on the doorframe in the near dark. Outside, the blizzard made its enormous, indifferent sound. The cabin held. "I'm glad you came out," he said. "Tonight. I'm glad you didn't stay inside." A pause from the dark of the kitchen. When she spoke, her voice was quiet and without performance, just the plain fact of it. "I know," she said. "I could tell." He went and lay down on the cot and looked at the ceiling and listened to the storm. And for the first time in a very long time, for the first time maybe since the afternoon Margaret Hale had stood in his doorway and looked at the floor, he felt the particular sensation of a man who is exactly where he is supposed to be. He didn't try to reason around it. He just let it sit. The way you let something sit when it's true, and you know it's true, and arguing with it serves no purpose. The blizzard ran another 18 hours. When it broke the following afternoon, the world outside was white and still and enormous, and the light that came through the cabin window was the particular blue-white of post-storm winter that had no equivalent in any other season. Silas went out and checked the barn and found the animals unhappy but accounted for, the calf on its feet and moving stiffly but moving. He spent the afternoon breaking a path to the water supply and checking the fence line for damage, which was significant on the northwest side and would need a week of work. When he came back in at dusk, Evelyn had supper on and the lamp lit and had apparently spent part of the afternoon going through the account book and making notes that she set aside when he came in, without comment, the way she set things aside when the moment called for something else. They ate. They cleaned up. She sat with her mending. Her hands, he noticed, were moving stiffly, and she flexed them between stitches in a way that told him they were still sore and that she was not going to say so. He didn't say anything about it either, but before he turned down the lamp that night, he went to the shelf and found the tin of the salve he kept for saddle sores on the horses, which also worked on cold-damaged skin, and set it on the table where she would see it in the morning. She didn't mention it the next day, but when he came in for the midday meal, the tin was back on the shelf, and her hands moved more freely than they had at breakfast. That was the way they were. Neither of them was graceful about receiving help. Neither of them said more than they meant to say. But they had found, without discussing it or deciding on it, a language for the things they couldn't say outright. Small, practical gestures, things left within reach. The willingness to hold a light when someone else needed both hands free. It wasn't the life either of them had planned, but it was the life that had built itself around them, the way things grow in the places where two rivers meet, not because anyone arranged it, but because the conditions were right, and the ground was ready, and the water found its own way. The week after the blizzard was the hardest kind of work. Not dramatic, not dangerous, just relentless. The northwest fence line had lost 11 posts, which meant stringing wire in temperatures that kept the metal stiff and uncooperative. The water supply pipe had frozen at the joint nearest the barn and needed to be thawed and resealed before the next cold snap hit, which Pete predicted would come by Thursday. 2 of the hay bales in the northwest corner of the barn had gotten wet when the storm found a gap in the roof boards, and wet hay in winter was a problem that compounded itself if you didn't deal with it immediately. Silas dealt with all of it. So did Evelyn. So did Pete, who seemed to regard the blizzard's damage as a personal affront and worked with the particular grim energy of a man settling a score. They didn't talk much during that week. There wasn't time, and there wasn't need. They developed, over the course of 10 months, the working shorthand of people who have learned each other's rhythms well enough that a look or a gesture carried what a sentence would have. She handed him things before he asked for them. He checked the things she'd said needed checking without her having to follow up. It was efficient, and it was quiet, and it was, Silas was aware, a kind of intimacy that he had not planned for and could not now imagine being without. On the Friday after the blizzard, Pete finished the last of the fence repair, collected his week's pay, and rode off down the lane with the cheerful indifference of a man whose part of a problem has been solved. Silas stood at the barn door and watched him go, and then stood there a while longer, looking at the repaired fence line, at the white fields, at the gray December sky. He had something he needed to say to Evelyn. He'd been carrying it since the night of the blizzard, since sitting at the kitchen table watching her hands recover in the warm water, since that moment in the near-dark doorway when he told her he was glad she came out, and she'd said, "I know, I could tell." He'd been carrying it the way you carry something that's gotten heavier each day. You don't set it down. And he was tired of the weight of it. The problem was that Silas Boone was not a man built for the kind of conversation he needed to have. He could fix a fence, he could negotiate a grain price, he could sit with a cow through a difficult night and keep his head. But saying the true and complicated thing out loud, to the person it concerned, in the full knowledge that it could not be taken back, that required a kind of courage that he had always found harder than physical work, and that he had been avoiding with varying degrees of success for 11 years. He went inside. Evelyn was at the table with a letter she was writing, to Clara Voss, he thought. They'd been corresponding since the fall. She looked up when he came in and read something in his face, because she was good at that, better than most people, and she set her pen down. "Sit down," she said. Not a question. He sat. He put his hands on the table and looked at them and then looked at her. "I need to tell you something," he said. and I need to do it without you helping me get through it, which I know is going to be difficult. Something moved through her eyes, amusement, and something more careful underneath it. All right, she said. He took a breath. When I wrote that letter to the agency, the one asking for a plain wife, I told myself it was practical, that I wanted a woman who'd value loyalty, who wouldn't be chasing a better situation. That was true, as far as it went. He paused. But it wasn't the whole truth. She waited. She was very good at waiting. The whole truth is that I was scared, he said. The words sat on the table between them, ugly and plain. Not of you, not of any particular woman, just scared of caring about someone and having it matter too much, of building something again and watching it walk out the door. He looked at the grain of the table. I thought if I could control what she looked like, I could control whether it hurt. If the woman wasn't beautiful, she wouldn't have other options. She wouldn't leave, and I'd be safe. He stopped. That's the most foolish thing I've ever believed, and I've believed some foolish things. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved across the fields with a sound like breathing. Margaret, she said. It wasn't a question. He told her about Margaret in pieces over the months, the way you tell someone things when you've stopped actively guarding against it. Not in one conversation, but in small increments, when something came up that made it relevant. She'd listened each time without particular reaction, without the commentary that some people felt entitled to about your past. Yes, he said. She left for someone with more money. She left for someone with more money, yes. And I spent 2 years angry at her, and then I spent several more years being careful, keeping things at a distance. He looked up. That's not the worst thing a person can do. But it's not a way to live, either. Evelyn folded her hands on the table. He noticed, not for the first time, that they were capable hands. Not soft, not decorative, but strong and practical with small scars he'd learned the stories of gradually. She looked at him with the direct steadiness that had startled him on the train platform 10 months ago, and that he had come to regard as one of the most honest things about her. I knew why you wrote what you wrote, she said quietly. Not the specifics, but the shape of it. A man who specifically requests a plain wife isn't looking for convenience. He's protecting something. A pause. I thought I could show you that was unnecessary. I wasn't sure it would work. You weren't sure. You were very stubborn in February, she said. He almost smiled. I was. And March. A brief pause. Parts of April. You could have mentioned it. I mentioned plenty of things. She held his gaze. Some things you have to let people figure out for themselves. If I told you in February that your whole arrangement was built on fear, you'd have driven me back to Garfield Station. She said it without self-congratulation, just the plain observation. The timing had to be yours. He sat with that. It was true, and it was uncomfortable in the particular way that true things are when they reveal how well someone has understood you without your permission. I want to ask you something, he said. And I want an honest answer, not the answer you think I need. When have I ever given you the answer I thought you needed? She said. That was also fair. Were you ever going to say something if this conversation hadn't happened today? Would you have brought it up yourself? She was quiet for longer than usual. Her fingers moved slightly on the table, the way they moved when she was working through something. I don't know, she said finally, and he could tell she meant it. I wanted to. A pause. But wanting is different from doing, and I've been protecting something too. She looked at the table. I married Thomas Hart when I was 22, and I loved him in the way that you love someone who is consistently kind to you and means well and tries hard. That's a real kind of love. I'm not dismissing it. She stopped. But he didn't want to know what I thought about things. Not really. He asked sometimes the way a man asks when he's being courteous. He didn't want the actual answer. She looked up. After 10 years of giving answers nobody wanted, I got careful about it. I stopped offering what wasn't asked for, even when I wanted to. Silas looked at her across the table. He thought about February, about how she'd walked into his operation on day 2 and started pointing out everything that could be better, and how he'd resisted it, and how he'd come around to it, and how the entire shape of the past 10 months had been built on the fact that she had kept offering what she observed regardless of whether he'd asked for it. He thought about the account book, the grain price, the hay rotation, the wheat field, the lantern in the blizzard. You stopped offering what wasn't asked for, he said slowly. I tried to. And yet, she looked at him with that direct gaze. You were different, she said simply. Even when you were stubborn, you pushed back, but you were actually listening. That's rarer than people think. She paused. I didn't mean to care about that, about whether you were listening. It was a practical arrangement, and I came here for practical reasons. And then she stopped, pressed her lips together, looked at the table and then back at him. Then Bessie's calf was born, and you said thank you for tonight like you actually meant it. And that was the beginning of the problem. He looked at her for a long moment. The lamp on the shelf was burning in the afternoon light, which was fading now toward the early winter dark, and the stove was doing its job, and the cabin was as warm as it ever was in December. It's a problem, is it? He said. For a woman who came here to be practical, yes. She said it with the dry edge she used when she was being honest about something she found inconvenient. It complicates the arrangement. What if I don't want the arrangement? She looked at him carefully. Define what you mean. I mean, he stopped, started again. This was the part he'd been carrying the longest, the part with the most weight. I mean that what's been happening here for 10 months is not an arrangement. It stopped being an arrangement a long time ago, and we've both been pretending otherwise, and I'm tired of pretending. He held her gaze. I want to marry you, Evelyn, properly, not as a practical arrangement and not out of convenience, because I don't know how to do this. He gestured, slightly helplessly, at the space between them, at the cabin, at the window looking out on the repaired fence and the white fields, without you in it anymore. And I don't want to learn. The silence that followed was not short. Evelyn sat very still with her hands on the table and looked at him, and he could not fully read her face, which was unusual and made the silence heavier. He sat with it. He'd said what he had to say, and there wasn't any taking it back now, and he was, despite everything, not sorry he'd said it. Silas, she said. Yes. I have been in love with you since approximately the calving in April. He blinked. Something in his chest did something he didn't have a clean word for. 9 months ago. Give or take. She looked at him with an expression that was exasperated and warm at the same time. You are the most difficult man to say that to. You could have led with it. You were not ready in April. She said it with a patience that was fond rather than critical. Or May. Or the summer, mostly. A pause. You were getting there by fall, I thought. I was getting there by fall, he confirmed. She looked at him. He looked at her. Outside the winter light was going fast, the way it did in December, and the fields were turning from white to blue in the dusk. Yes, she said. He wasn't sure for a moment whether that was an answer or a continuation of something she'd been saying. Yes, what? Yes, I'll marry you, she said, with the particular patience of a woman who has already been 10 months in the company of a man slow to say what he means. Properly, that's what you were asking. That's what I was asking. Then yes. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Her hand turned and held his, and her grip was firm and unsentimental, which was exactly right, and they sat like that in the cooling afternoon light while the winter settled in around the ranch and the lamp burned between them. It was not a perfect moment. His hands were rough from a week of fence work, and hers were still slightly stiff from the cold damage of the blizzard. And the lamp needed trimming, and there was a list on the shelf with the week's remaining tasks on it, and neither of them was the kind of person who forgot about the tasks just because something significant had happened. In a few minutes, he would trim the lamp and she would finish her letter to Clara, and they would have supper and talk about the spring planning and whether to expand the herd by 6 or 8 head in February. But right now he held her hand across the kitchen table of the ranch that was becoming something different from what he'd built alone, and she held his. And they looked at each other with the specific clarity of two people who have stopped pretending they don't know what this is. They married on the second Saturday of January in Garfield, in a simple ceremony at the county office with Clara Voss and Pete Greer as witnesses. Evelyn wore her best dress, which was dark blue and plain and suited her exactly. Silas wore the coat he'd bought in '74 and had barely used since. Pete cried, which surprised everyone, including Pete, who spent the remainder of the day pretending it hadn't happened. Clara Voss brought a cake she'd made herself and told Evelyn afterward, with the direct warmth of a woman who doesn't waste words, "You're the best thing that's happened to this county in 20 years, and that includes the new well." Roy Mercer heard about the marriage and sent no word. Dale Hutchins came by the week after with a bottle of something that probably wasn't legal and shook Silas's hand for longer than was necessary and said to Evelyn, "I put in the wheat rotation you suggested in October. Best yield I've had in 6 years," which was Dale Hutchins' version of a wedding gift and was received as such. The thing about Garfield, about any small settlement on the frontier, was that it was not one community but several communities that had to coexist, and those communities did not always agree about what was proper and what was strange and what a woman was permitted to be. The people who had watched Evelyn with suspicion did not, for the most part, change their minds because Silas married her. Roy Mercer remained Roy Mercer. There were women who thought Evelyn's confidence was an imposition on the natural order of things, and they did not stop thinking so. But there were also the Hutchins yield numbers, which traveled. There was the bull-sharing arrangement, which had improved the stock on 3 properties. There was the feed store accounting that Evelyn had quietly helped 2 different ranch wives work through over the winter at Clara Voss's kitchen table on Sunday afternoons, without making an occasion of it. There was the simple fact, available to anyone who wanted to look, that the Boone Ranch had changed in a year in ways that took most operations a decade. Silas was aware of all of this. He was also aware of something simpler and harder to account book, that he was no longer a man managing a ranch alone and calling it enough. He was a man who came in at the end of a day's work to a table where someone was going to tell him something true and argue with him about it if necessary, and know when to let a thing go and when to hold her ground. He was a man who had, without planning to and despite considerable resistance, built something with someone. One evening in late January, sitting by the stove after supper with the account books done and the lamp turned down low, Evelyn said, "You know Roy Mercer told his wife that you only married me because I made myself useful before you could get rid of me." Silas looked up from the piece of leather he was mending. "Is that so?" "That's what Dorothy Mercer told Clara. Clara told me." She was working her mending with her usual focused calm. "I thought you should know what's being said." "What did you tell Clara?" "I told her I thought it was partly true," Evelyn said. "That usefulness was a significant part of the early negotiation." She glanced at him. "I left out the rest. It's not Roy Mercer's business." He looked at her. "You're not bothered by it." She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about things. "I'm bothered by the implication that it's an insult," she said. "Being useful to someone is not a shameful way to make yourself indispensable. I'd rather be indispensable for what I can do than ornamental for what I look like." A pause. "Besides, Roy Mercer's cattle look worse every year, and I did suggest a solution to that at the Hutchins gathering in October, which he chose to ignore." Silas bent back over his leather work. "His loss." "His loss," she agreed. He worked for a while in the comfortable silence that had become their natural condition at the end of a day. The kind of silence that 2 people only arrive at after they have run out of things they need to prove to each other. Outside, the January wind was doing its thing, finding the corners of the cabin, testing the caulking on the north wall, which held. "Evelyn," he said, without looking up. "Yes." "For what it's worth, it wasn't only the usefulness." A small pause. When she spoke, her voice was quiet and a shade warmer than usual. "I know," she said. "It wasn't only that for me, either." The lamp burned low between them, and the stove kept its warmth, and the Kansas winter did what it always did outside, which was everything it could, and the cabin held against it, the way things do when they're built right and tended right, and not abandoned when they need attention. That was enough. For now, it was more than enough. Spring came to the Boone Ranch the way it always came to the Kansas plains. Not gently, not all at once, but in arguments. A warm week followed by a cold snap, green pushing through the dead grass, and then a frost that set it back, the land taking its time, which was the land's right. Silas had always found the uncertainty of early spring irritating. You couldn't plan against it, couldn't reason with it, could only do the work and absorb the setbacks and keep moving. This March, watching the first green push through the south pasture from the cabin window with a cup of coffee in his hand, he found he minded it less than usual. Evelyn came up beside him and looked at the same window, the same pasture, the same tentative green. She had her own coffee, and her hair was pinned back already, which meant she'd been up before him, which was not unusual. "Eastfield is ready to turn," she said. "I know. Pete said he can start Tuesday if the weather holds. I'll tell him Monday." She glanced at him sideways. "You're in a good mood." "I'm in my normal mood." "Your normal mood involves less looking out windows." He looked at her. She was watching him with that expression, the one that was fond and direct at the same time, the one he'd stopped trying to deflect. "It's a good spring," he said. "It's a reasonable spring so far," she said, which was Evelyn's version of optimism, and he knew the difference now. The Eastfield went in on Wednesday. The partial wheat rotation they'd argued about the previous February had done well enough in the first year that they'd expanded it this spring to 40% of the field. The alfalfa on the remainder was already showing early, which Pete regarded as a good sign, and which Evelyn regarded with the cautious practicality of a woman who had learned not to count things before they were harvested. What was already clear by that second spring was that the ranch was not the same operation it had been 18 months ago. The numbers in the account book, which Silas now understood as well as Evelyn did, because she'd insisted on going through them together every month rather than presenting him with conclusions, told a story that surprised him when he looked at it laid out clearly. Feed costs down, livestock yield up. The wheat rotation adding a revenue stream that the alfalfa alone hadn't provided. The bull sharing arrangement saving 3 properties money while improving the herd quality across all 3. None of it was miraculous. That was the thing Silas had come to understand about how Evelyn worked. There was nothing miraculous in it, nothing that required special talent unavailable to ordinary people. It was attention, applied consistently, to the right things. It was asking the right questions before making decisions rather than after. It was being willing to change an approach when the numbers said to change it without ego getting in the way. He'd gotten better at that last part. It hadn't come naturally. The question of Roy Mercer came to a head in May at the county agricultural meeting in Garfield, a semi-annual gathering that Silas had attended every year with no particular engagement, sitting in the back and leaving when the talking ran long. This year Evelyn came with him, which was not unusual for a rancher's wife to do, but which, in their specific case, meant that when the discussion turned to the common grazing issue on the North County boundary, and when Evelyn knew something directly relevant from her research into the county land records, she said so. She did it quietly and with clear sourcing. She'd looked at the records. Here was what she found. Here was why it mattered to the grazing question. She was not performing. She was just providing information that the group needed. Roy Mercer, who was sitting 2 rows ahead of them, turned around and said, in a tone calibrated to be heard by the room, "I don't recall this being an open floor to everyone's wife." The room went quiet in the particular way that rooms go quiet when something has been said that requires everyone to choose a position. Silas felt the stillness go through him. He was aware of Evelyn beside him, of the quality of stillness in her, the way she absorbed things like this without visible reaction, which he knew by now was not absence of feeling but the opposite. He was also aware of Pete, who was sitting on his other side and had gone very still in his own way. He stood up. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't perform it. He just stood and looked at Roy Mercer's turned-around face and said, clearly enough for the room to hear, "My wife is presenting information relevant to the question you just spent 20 minutes trying to settle without an answer. You can listen to her or you can keep talking in circles. Your choice, Roy." A silence. Someone in the back row coughed. Dale Hutchins, to his left, said, "I'd like to hear the information." 2 or 3 other voices followed that. Mercer turned back around without another word, with the stiff posture of a man who has lost a small thing and intends to hold the larger version of it indefinitely. Silas sat back down. Evelyn presented the information. It took 4 minutes. It settled the grazing question in a way that the room had failed to settle it in the previous 40. The meeting moved on. Afterward, walking back to the wagon, Pete said, "That was something." "Don't start," Silas said. "I'm not starting anything," Pete said. He lit a cigarette and looked off down the street. "I'm just saying, that was something." He glanced at Evelyn. "You all right?" "I'm fine," she said. She meant it, which Pete could tell. He nodded and left it there. Silas handed her up into the wagon, a gesture she still sometimes declined, depending on the day and her mood, And she took his hand this time and climbed up without comment. He went around and got up on his side and picked up the reins, and they drove out of Garfield in the late May afternoon, with the cottonwoods leafing out along the creek road and the sky doing the enormous thing it did in Kansas when the weather was good. After a while, she said, "You didn't have to do that." "I know. I've handled Roy Mercer before." "I know that too." He watched the road. "I wanted to." She was quiet beside him for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "You'd have done the same," he said, which was not deflection, but true. She had, repeatedly, in her own way, stood between him and things that could have made him smaller if he'd let them. She reached over and put her hand briefly on his arm, which was a gesture she made sometimes when words felt insufficient, and she was not willing to be insufficient, and then she took it back and they drove home, in the particular comfortable silence of two people who do not need to fill every space. Roy Mercer, to his credit, came to Silas that August with a question about his cattle's weight loss and a look on his face that cost him something. Silas told him to ask Evelyn because she knew more about it than he did, and there was no point pretending otherwise. Mercer asked her at the fence line between their properties with the stiff courtesy of a man doing something difficult. She answered him without triumph and without false warmth, just straightforwardly, because the cattle were the issue and the cattle didn't care about the history between the people managing them. Mercer's cattle did better that winter. He didn't come back to thank her, but he didn't say anything at the December meeting when she raised a question about the county road maintenance that affected everyone's ability to get to Garfield in mud season. He sat and listened, which, from Roy Mercer, was its own kind of acknowledgement. People, Silas had come to understand, did not change easily or all at once. They changed in the way the seasons changed, in arguments with setbacks, pushing forward and pulling back, and then one day you looked up and something was different, and you couldn't point to the specific moment it happened. The county was like that with Evelyn. Not a conversion, not a resolution, just a gradual, grudging, practical recognition that the information she provided was usually correct and the results of following it were usually good, and that this mattered more in the end than the discomfort of where it came from. Clara Voss told Evelyn at the end of the second year over coffee at the dry goods store, "You know what you've done here." "I've done what I came here to do," Evelyn said. "More than that." Clara set her cup down. "There are 3 women in this county who are now keeping their own household accounts because you showed Dorothy Mercer how to read hers, and Dorothy told Rebecca Colton, and Rebecca told the Marsh girl. Did you know that?" Evelyn looked at her. "I didn't know Dorothy told anyone." "Dorothy tells everyone," Clara said. "The difference is what she tells them." She regarded Evelyn with the frank warmth of a woman who has seen enough of the world to know what's rare in it. "You didn't make anyone feel small," that's what she said. "You showed her the numbers and you explained what they meant, and you didn't once make her feel stupid for not knowing." She remembered that. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was even, but he could hear something in it that was not entirely steady. "Thomas used to tell me I explained things too thoroughly," she said, "that I treated people like they needed a lecture." "Thomas," Clara said, "was probably a fine man and not always right." A short silence, and then Evelyn said, "No, he wasn't always right." She picked up her cup. "Not about that." Silas was not at that conversation. Evelyn told him about it in the evening, as she sometimes did with things Clara said, because Clara's observations tended to have weight, and Evelyn had gotten into the habit of bringing things with weight home to examine with him. He sat across from her at the table and listened and said nothing until she was done. "She's right," he said then. Evelyn looked at him. "About how you explain things," he said. "You don't make people feel small. I'd know. You explained a lot of things to me in February that I didn't want to hear." He paused. "I never once felt small about it. Annoyed sometimes, never small." She looked at him with an expression that was trying, not entirely successfully, to remain composed. "That might be the kindest thing you've ever said to me." "I have a limited budget for kind things," he said. "I spend it where it counts." She made a sound that was halfway between a laugh and something softer, and looked down at the table, and he looked at her. And in the lamplight of the kitchen of the ranch that was no longer barely surviving, but was, by any honest measure, thriving, he thought about how the best things that had happened to him in his life had arrived in forms he hadn't recognized. He had asked for a plain wife and gotten one, in the only sense that mattered. a woman without pretense or performance, who said what she meant and meant what she said and did not change her shape to fit whoever was watching. If that was plain, then plain was the wrong word for it. He'd been using the wrong words for most of his life. He was getting better. The sun came in the fall of 1879, on a Tuesday in October, with the particular stubbornness of someone who has decided on his own schedule regardless of what anyone else has planned. They named him William, after no one in particular, because neither of them had family names that carried more good memories than bad, and they wanted the boy to start unencumbered. Pete held the baby at the kitchen table with the expression of a man holding something fragile and irreplaceable and trying to look casual about it, and failed to look casual about it, and nobody said so. Clara Voss came with the cake she always brought when something worth marking happened, and sat with Evelyn while Silas walked Pete out to his horse, and they stood in the October afternoon for a moment. "You did all right," Pete said. "The boy did most of the work," Silas said. Pete looked at him with the sideways look he'd been giving him for 20 years. "I meant with all of it," he said. "The whole thing." He got on his horse. "You were a stubborn fool for a while there." "I was. Good thing she's patient." "She's not particularly patient," Silas said. "She just knew when to push and when to wait. That's different." Pete considered this. "I suppose it is," he said, and rode away down the lane in the October light. Silas stood outside the cabin for a moment after Pete's horse disappeared around the bend. The cottonwoods along the creek were fully yellow now, the way they got in October, and the fields had that end-of-season look, harvested, cleared, resting. The sky was the kind of blue that only arrived in autumn, deep and clear and enormous. He looked at the north wall of the cabin. The caulking he'd done in that first February was still holding, though it would need attention in the spring. The barn door hung straight on its hinges because Evelyn had noticed it hanging wrong in March 1878, and he'd fixed it in April. The fence line was complete, every post in place. The east field had come in well this year, better than the first year, and Pete was already talking about whether they should consider expanding the wheat to 60%. None of this was what he'd planned. He'd planned for a quiet life, a manageable life, one where nothing could hurt him because nothing mattered enough to hurt. What he'd gotten instead was a life that was complicated and frequently inconvenient and involved more arguments than he'd anticipated and more laughter than he'd expected, and which had produced, most recently, a small and stubborn person named William who had his mother's gray-green eyes and apparently her habit of wanting things on his own schedule. He went back inside. Evelyn was sitting up in the bed with the baby, and Clara was at the table with her own cup of coffee, talking about something in the easy way of two women who have had enough conversations to skip the preamble. Silas stopped in the doorway and looked at the room, at the lamp and the stove and the mended curtains and the account books on the shelf and the list of winter tasks that still needed doing, and at his wife holding their son in the yellow October light coming through the window. It was not a perfect picture. The cabin was small and needed expanding before the boy needed his own space. Clara's cake was already half gone and he hadn't had any. His back was sore from the last 2 weeks of harvest work. There was a list on the shelf, but Evelyn looked up and met his eyes. And what was in her expression was not the inventory look, not the appraising look, but the one he'd seen gradually more of this past year. The unguarded one. The one she gave him when she wasn't managing how she appeared, when she had simply stopped keeping distance. He crossed to the bed and sat on the edge of it and looked at the boy, who was asleep with the complete conviction of someone with no concerns about the immediate future. "He looks like you," Silas said. "He has your chin," Evelyn said. "That's not necessarily an advantage." She looked at him with that expression that was fond and exasperated and warm. "It'll suit him," she said. He put his hand on the boy's back, small and warm, the breathing of something new in the world. He sat with that for a moment. This was the thing nobody told you about fear, he thought. Not the fear of blizzards or failed harvests or hard winters, which were real and manageable because they were external. The fear that was actually dangerous was the kind you turned inward, the kind that made you build walls and call them wisdom, the kind that convinced you the only safe way to live was smaller, less attached, less invested, less present. He had lived that way for years and called it self-sufficiency, and been wrong about what that word meant. What self-sufficiency actually looked like, he understood now, was not doing everything alone. It was knowing your own limits clearly enough to let someone else's strengths fill them. It was being honest about what you were afraid of instead of building a life around hiding it. It was marrying a woman not because she was unlikely to leave, but because staying was what you both chose. Every day, in the small practical choosing of people who have decided each other is worth the risk. Evelyn had known her own worth before she ever stepped off the train in Garfield. That had been her difficulty and her strength from the beginning. She knew what she was, and she didn't make herself smaller to make other people more comfortable. And the world had spent 30 years trying to convince her this was a problem. It wasn't a problem. It was the thing that had built this ranch into what it was. It was the thing that had built him into something somewhat better than what he'd been. Clara left in the afternoon with the remainder of the cake wrapped for them and instructions for Evelyn that were practical and affectionate in equal measure. The cabin went quiet. William slept. Evelyn rested with the particular exhaustion of someone who has done something enormous and is not going to mention how enormous it was. Silas sat in the chair by the stove and looked at the room and did not reach for the account books or the list of tasks. He let the afternoon be the afternoon. After a while, from the bed, Evelyn said, "What are you thinking about?" "The north fence line," he said, because that was true. A pause. "And?" He looked at her across the cabin. "And this," he said. "All of it." She looked back at him with those gray-green eyes, steady and direct. The way she had looked at him on the train platform in February of 1878, when he'd told her she wasn't what he expected. She hadn't apologized then. She hadn't explained herself or made herself smaller or waited to see whether he approved. She had just looked at him and waited for him to catch up. He had eventually. It had taken longer than it should have, and she had been patient with it, in the way that was not patience exactly, but was something more accurate. The willingness to let the right thing take the time it needed without giving up on it. Outside, the October afternoon was doing what October afternoons did in Kansas, which was burn gold and cold at the edges and remind you that winter was coming but hadn't come yet, and that the time between was worth something. The cottonwoods along the creek threw long shadows across the yard. Somewhere out in the field, the cattle moved with the unhurried purpose of animals that have been well managed and know where they're going. The boy breathed. The stove ticked. The north wall held. Silas Boone sat in his chair in the home he had built and thought about the letter he had written 4 years earlier, the careful, frightened, foolish letter asking for a plain wife, and felt something that was not quite gratitude and not quite amusement, but lived somewhere between them. He had gotten exactly what he asked for, in the only sense that had ever truly mattered. A woman who had to rely on something other than her looks to get by in this world. He just hadn't understood when he wrote it what that actually meant, what it looked like, what it cost, and what it was worth, and how thoroughly it would change the shape of everything he thought he'd already figured out. He knew now. Some lessons come easy and some come hard, and some you have to be shown 17 different ways before you finally stop arguing with them. The ones that cost the most to learn are usually the ones you carry the longest, not as wounds, but as the kind of understanding that only comes from having been wrong in a way that mattered, and then having someone hold a light steady while you found your way to something better. The afternoon light moved across the floor of the cabin, and William slept and Evelyn closed her eyes, and the ranch held its ground against the coming winter, the way it had learned to hold its ground, the way anything does when it's been built right and tended with honesty and not abandoned when the season gets hard. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything.
Alright, well, let's buy another walkie, I guess.
That was a fucked ass level.
Dude, we had so much money that was sitting like all 10 feet away from the ship if someone had just been able to fucking grab it, bro. We literally we left behind like $300, $400 worth of shit.
I had quite a bit of money on me too.
Yeah, I had so much money, and Zerti had the apparatus and ran the wrong way, even though he could have made it back.
Yeah.
What a bot.
Unlucky.
Dude, I don't know the apps.
You gotta learn.
Shit like that, it wouldn't be that bad to all have walkie-talkies though.
If you're just paying attention to ship, it wouldn't be bad. It would just be fine.
I'm just regarded, you know what I'm saying?
Don't hate on Zerti, I'm just saying, bro, he could have made it back to the ship. He just ran the wrong way. The ship was like literally, he could see the ship.
We're just not good enough for him, Zerty. We can never please him.
True.
I mean, I was right clicking. I wasn't seeing the ship pop up.
You could, yeah, that's whatever. I mean, I literally saw him stare at it on my screen and walk by it.
Is this the way to get up to the fucking fire exit?
There's no way.
Get to the fire exit.
Oh.
I don't give a damn about my reputation.
Bam, 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 bam. I wish there was like a item you could buy that was significantly more expensive that was just like a headlamp. And you could have like a light and a walkie-talkie at the same time. What the fuck is this, bro?
What?
The spikes?
Oh, there's a head.
Yeah, I know. No, you don't. I don't wish that.
Is it a mine shift? Yes.
Bang, 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 bang.
Did we get bored or something?
No, what?
What the fuck?
Well, Ben,
There's a landmine right here.
where?
Do it. Right here.
Where? Where?
Walk past it.
Motherfucker, man. Should have been Ben.
Oh, Zerty.
What's up? What happened?
We walked out of the elevator and there was a snare foot that immediately got on his head.